I think a lot of journalists have a blind spot. I think a lot of journalists, particularly in the West, they can only think of the church as this powerful institution with schools and hospitals and buildings. They don't think of parts of the world where Christians are a minority community. Aid to the Church in Need was set up following the devastation of the Second World War, initially to work with refugees who were displaced all across Europe. Today we're working in about 140 countries, and a hugely important part of our work has actually become advocacy for religious freedom, because what we have noticed, wherever there's conflict, wherever there's problems around the world, it is exacerbated by the denial of religious freedom. So this report is a really important part of that jigsaw.
And recently in news headlines, people would have seen that there's horrific things happening in Nigeria, particularly against Christians. Can you go into what's behind that?
Nigeria is a very complex picture because it's a huge country, of course, but in the north of Nigeria in particular, where Christians are suffering, I mean, this really is jihadi violence. This is Islamism that is really just determined to drive Christians from Nigeria. Nigeria is a country that's about 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, but there's a very, very strong push among some of those extremist elements to present it to the world as a Muslim country. And in their worldview, Christians just don't fit into that. So Christians in northern Nigeria have been the victims of the most horrendous violence, and this is violence that we document in this report. On a very practical level is we have a lot of material support. We work there in the internally displaced persons camps, so that's providing emergency relief, it's providing education, it's providing faith resources as well, because these are people of profound faith, because you know their lives would be much easier if they gave up their Christianity, but actually they cling to their faith. So we support them there in faith as well, very much in the field, very much in the area where they are. Our motto is so that Christians can thrive everywhere. We don't want a world where Christians can't live in certain places, where they have to flee certain places. We want to play a world where Christians can live everywhere. And on the international level, what we do with institutions like the European Union, the United Nations, national governments, we advocate on their behalf. Religious freedom is guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but this is something that's often ignored by the human rights community. So what we're saying at this time, when our governments and politicians say we have this heightened awareness about universal freedoms, why is there this blind spot when it comes to religious persecution, and particularly the persecution of Christians, because Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world today. I think one of the reasons why we don't hear about the scale of Christian persecution on a daily basis is I think a lot of journalists have a blind spot. I think a lot of journalists, particularly in the West, they can only think of the church as this powerful institution with schools and hospitals and buildings. They don't think of parts of the world where Christians are a minority community or where they are oppressed. So we really would be calling on journalists and policymakers to try to see beyond that blind spot, to try to see the reality of the situation. And that's why this report is so important. I mean, this is not just a collection of anecdotes. I mean, this report takes 2 years to compile. This is meticulously footnoted. We've documented all of these cases in quite a dispassionate way, and we've linked everything. So anyone who's interested in seeing the scale of this problem, it's laid out for them in the report.
Well, in so many countries at the moment, religious freedom has been denied to Christians, and in many, many countries now, Christians are being killed because of their faith. And incredibly, really, the issue has only raised its head in the Dáil for the first time, in my experience, yesterday, in terms of what's happening in Sudan. And, you know, we really haven't had a debate with regards to what's happening in Nigeria yet in Leinster House. And, you know, I do think it's important that we do focus on issues like what's happening in Palestine and Israel at the moment, but we do need balance. We need to make sure that we are not, these other issues are not eclipsed by one particular conflict in one location. As a country, we have influence and can help people around the world, and we need to make sure we spend that political capital in regions that really need it. And it's very, very clear that Christians are on the back foot, or in real trouble in places like Nigeria and Sudan at the moment. And I'm urging the government to actually look at what's happening, learn about what's happening, and effect change where they can in terms of the European Union, etc.
Well, thankfully, yes, in comparison to these countries in Ireland, it's not as stark, but we are seeing, unfortunately, a steady rise in religious intolerance and almost a dismissiveness of religious freedom in this country. And Pope Francis eloquently described it as polite persecution. I like to call it persecution with a smile. So to give it an accessible analogy, it could be maybe it's in a place of work and you have a religious ornament or a religious icon, and you're told by management to take it down for no other reason than it might offend somebody. Now, this is an intrinsic part of somebody's life, and they feel like, well, it should represent who I am, and it shouldn't cause offence. But these little symbols have become quite controversial now, and the polite persecution, it's being felt by people of faith, especially in maybe the political arena. We're seeing a lack of agency for Catholics, for Christians, and if people can't engage with their political system and get that representation, well then they're unfortunately going to be sidelined.
And do you think that there's perhaps a double standard when it comes to support for other ideologies, let's say LGBT? We know that every year those working for government bodies are essentially encouraged to wear rainbow flags and pride paraphernalia. Do you think that there's a double standard there?
Certainly we do have a very underlying commitment in the West now to principles such as inclusion and tolerance and all of those things. And yes, there is a contradiction when it comes to religious freedom and honouring religious freedom. We can see quite blatant double standards. What would be ordinarily described as offensive to someone maybe on representing a political ideology or representing a community or movement is not deemed offensive on the other side in terms of religious freedom. So we'd like to see a kind of a more harmonious approach between the two. Kind of one, if it's considered unequal, if it's considered offensive on one side, it must be considered unequal and offensive on the other side as well.